David thinks he owns it. I think he thinks that because I left the band in 1985, that he owns Pink Floyd, that he is Pink Floyd. I'm irrelevant.
By 1977, Pink Floyd had solidified its position as a global commercial force, largely due to the unprecedented successes of the albums Dark Side of the Moon in 1973 and Wish You Were Here in 1975. The band had reached the pinnacle of the music industry, securing immense wealth and international recognition. Yet beneath this outward stability, the internal working dynamics of the group were undergoing a fundamental shift. During the writing and recording of their 1977 album Animals, creative control began to consolidate increasingly in the hands of bassist and lyricist Roger Waters.
Yet another story of cancel culture. Why are they trying to cancel Roger Waters? Why aren't there real journalists going, hang on a minute, this is bullshit, maybe I'll call up?
The thematic material of the album, which focused heavily on societal roles and class structures, was driven entirely by Waters' conceptual vision. This shift in the balance of power immediately generated professional friction. Guitarist David Gilmour contributed significantly to the album's expansive, epic track Dogs, yet he ultimately found himself receiving fewer songwriting royalties than Waters, who dominated the credits on the album's shorter, framing tracks. Keyboardist Richard Wright also found his influence waning during this period. The collaborative environment that had characterized the band's earlier work was evaporating. Wright would later observe that this era marked the moment Waters began to view himself as the group's sole legitimate writer. Wright noted that as Waters began to develop what he described as ego trips, the primary target of his professional conflicts became Wright himself. Drummer Nick Mason corroborated this assessment of the Animals sessions, later recalling that Waters was actively keeping Gilmour down and deliberately frustrating him. Following the conclusion of the Animals tour, Waters conceptualized a new, highly ambitious project. He proposed a double concept album exploring deep themes of alienation, psychological barriers, and childhood trauma. He originally presented the concept under the working title, Bricks in the Wall. The narrative foundation of the project was heavily autobiographical, drawing directly from Waters' own life experiences. Specifically, it centered on the death of his father during the Second World War and Waters' subsequent growing feelings of isolation, both in his personal life and within the highly artificial environment of the music industry.
I don't know, 9 or 10, and he was 8 or 9. Yeah, we used to go and, make pottery crocodiles and paint a bit.
When Waters pitched the massive undertaking, Gilmour and Mason were initially cautious about the scale and the deeply personal nature of the material. However, recognizing the intensity of Waters' passion for the concept, they eventually agreed to move forward with the production. Recording sessions commenced in early 1979 at Super Bear Studios in France, before later moving to Ocean Way Recording in Los Angeles. To help manage the sprawling scope of the project, the band brought in producer Bob Ezrin, chosen specifically for his extensive experience with theatrical rock productions. Ezrin collaborated with Waters to draft a 40-page narrative script designed to flesh out the album's complex psychological storyline. As production progressed, Waters' perfectionism and absolute commitment to his personal vision began to dictate the daily realities of the studio. The pressure of the sessions was enormous, and the collaborative spirit of the band deteriorated further. Richard Wright found his role diminishing significantly by the week. Waters and Ezrin increasingly relied on programmed keyboards and outside session players to complete the instrumental tracks, effectively pushing Wright to the margins of his own band. The studio environment became intensely hostile. Wright would later state that nothing he attempted to do during the recording session seemed to please Waters. He recalled the deep humiliation of feeling completely on the outside looking in, while Waters and Ezrin commandeered the keyboard arrangements. Following a scheduled break in Greece, the situation reached a breaking point. Waters formally declared to the rest of the group that Wright was not contributing anything of value to the sessions, and demanded his removal. Gilmour, though frustrated by Waters' authoritarian approach, reluctantly agreed that Wright was underperforming in the studio. Before the final mixes of the album were even complete, Richard Wright was officially dismissed from Pink Floyd, losing his ownership stake in the partnership.
And of course it's been used so much, but if you remember the 60s, you went there phrase. I think John Peel coined it. I don't know.
I think it was.
And
yeah.
it's kind of true.
To avoid a public relations disruption that could derail the album's release, a quiet financial arrangement was made. Wright was retained as a salaried session musician for the upcoming promotional tour. This effectively meant that Waters had ousted the band's co-founder for the duration of the project, leaving most fans entirely unaware that Wright was no longer an official member of Pink Floyd. The other members fared marginally better in the studio, but the strain was evident. Gilmour contributed legendary lead guitar work, most notably his soaring solo on the track Comfortably Numb, but he consistently felt sidelined in the broader production decisions. Gilmour would later reflect that while every band requires a balancing act, Waters had established his own rigid way of operating, forcing Gilmour to fight simply to find his own voice within the music. Nick Mason, meanwhile, found the endless overdubs and technical demands tortuous. Preferring to avoid direct confrontation, Mason eventually stepped back from the control room, leaving the final mixing decisions almost entirely to Waters. Despite the internal fracturing and the collapse of their personal friendships, the recording process yielded a massive artistic output. By late 1979, the epic double album was complete. The Architecture of Isolation. Released on November 30th, 1979, The Wall was an immediate and overwhelming commercial phenomenon. It debuted to massive sales, quickly reaching #1 on the United States Billboard charts, a position it would hold for 15 consecutive weeks. It also reached #3 in the United Kingdom. The album produced 2 major international hit singles. Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, featuring its iconic children's choir, reached #1 in both the US and the UK. The phrasing of the lyric, "We don't need no education," was deliberately constructed with a grammatical error to authentically capture the voice of rebellious schoolchildren, quickly turning the track into a global anti-authority anthem. The critical and commercial consensus recognized the album as a monumental achievement in rock sequencing. Musically, it was a grand suite comprising 16 distinct tracks, including complex instrumental passages and vocal theatricality. Waters wrote every lyric on the album and co-wrote the majority of the music, with Gilmour contributing compositions to 3 tracks. The narrative followed a protagonist named Pink, a deeply alienated rock star who served as a direct psychological surrogate for Waters himself. The lyrics chronicled Pink as he systematically built emotional walls to shield himself from a series of life traumas. The track, Another Brick Part 1, directly addressed the wartime loss of his father. Mother offered a biting, satirical look at overprotective parenting. Hey You served as a desperate plea for human connection from behind the psychological barrier, while the climactic ballad, Comfortably Numb, explored the dark reality of drug detachment and the numbness required to survive the pressures of fame. Waters insisted that every lyric and sound effect was intended as a metaphorical story, later stating that he appreciated how the songs could mean different things to different people. He rejected the literal interpretations and conspiracy theories that fans often projected onto the music, maintaining that the album was a study of emotional isolation. With the album dominating global charts, the band shifted its focus to live performance. The ensuing string of concerts, running from February 1980 to June 1981, presented one of the most elaborate and technically demanding stage productions ever attempted in rock history. Waters' original conception of the show was entirely literal. He envisioned a massive physical barrier being constructed between the performers and the audience over the course of the concert. He would later explain that when he initially drew the wall and explained the concept to the crew, they thought he was mad. He insisted that by the end of the show, the audience should not be able to see or hear the band anymore. To execute this vision, the production crew built a 12-meter-high wall, brick by brick, across the stage during the performance. The show utilized giant inflatable puppets representing the authoritarian figures from the album's narrative, including a grotesque schoolmaster and a flying pig. The production also featured dangerous pyrotechnics, including a staged airplane crash that accidentally set fire to the stage curtains on the tour's opening night. The logistical demands of the 31-show tour, which traveled through the US, the UK, and Germany, were staggering.
Kind of universal appeal in that it confronts a number of major psychological and emotional concerns.
Before the band even played the first note of the opening concert, the production had incurred costs of $1.5 million. Pink Floyd operated at a financial loss during the early stages of the tour. Nick Mason would later comment on the sheer absurdity of the logistics, noting the massive fleets of semi-trucks required to move the equipment. He stated plainly that the problem with the show was that it simply wasn't designed as a touring production. It was absurdly expensive and not something other acts would ever realistically attempt. The staging further isolated the band members from one another. At one notable point in the show, Gilmour was required to perform his guitar solo for Comfortably Numb while standing on a small platform positioned at the very top of the completed wall, illuminated only by a single spotlight from the darkness, physically elevated and separated from his bandmates below. The grueling nature of the tour, combined with the hostile interpersonal dynamics, pushed the band to its breaking point. On June 17, 1981, Pink Floyd performed the final date of the Wall tour in London. As the massive wall was ceremonially smashed down at the end of the concert, few in the audience realized the permanence of the fracture. It would be the last time Pink Floyd performed a concert with Roger Waters for 24 years. Following the conclusion of the tour, Waters immediately turned his attention to adapting the album into a feature film. Directed by Alan Parker and released in August 1982, Pink Floyd The Wall combined live-action sequences featuring musician Bob Geldof as Pink, with surreal, nightmarish animations created by artist Gerald Scarfe. The production of the film was fraught with tension. Waters maintained strict opinions on the visual translation of his work, at one point forcing a complete rewrite of the initial film treatment after dismissing it as bollocks. Despite his demands, Waters took little creative part in the actual daily production of the film, and Gilmour later confirmed that none of the band members were truly involved in the filmmaking process. Financially, the film achieved a modest domestic gross of approximately $14.8 million. Critically, it was recognized for its technical achievements, winning 2 BAFTA awards for Best Sound and Best Original Song, cementing the multimedia legacy of the project. A spent force creatively. As the film reached theaters, the members of Pink Floyd drifted further apart, alienating themselves in separate solo endeavors. Gilmour released the solo album About Face in 1984, later admitting the project was driven largely by his need to express frustration with Waters' dominance. Wright, still legally excluded from the band, formed a short-lived duo called Z, while Mason released a solo record titled Profiles. Waters himself began developing concepts that would eventually become his first solo album, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. In 1983, the band briefly reconvened to fulfill contractual obligations, resulting in the album The Final Cut. The project functioned almost entirely as a Roger Waters solo album released under the Pink Floyd name. Exploring themes of war and political betrayal, the record featured songwriting credits attributed solely to Waters, with the minor exception of 2 tracks co-written by Gilmour. The internal isolation during the Final Cut sessions was absolute. Richard Wright was entirely absent. Gilmour and Mason provided their instrumental tracks, but had no influence over the album's direction. The visual presentation of the record made no secret of the internal divide. The only photograph of the band included in the liner notes featured just Gilmour and Mason, with Waters entirely absent from the frame. While the album reached #1 in the UK charts, it sold fewer than 5 million copies, a stark drop from the historic commercial heights of its predecessor. By late 1984, the professional partnership had irreparably collapsed. Gilmour, Mason, and Waters met at a restaurant to discuss the future of the band. The conversation yielded no compromise. He filed a lawsuit intended to legally dissolve the Pink Floyd partnership entirely, and block Gilmour and Mason from ever using the band's name or performing its material.
Of life, the worries, the travel, mortality, money, and so on.
In his legal filings and public statements, Waters argued that the band had become a spent force creatively. He contended that Gilmour and Mason had effectively forced him to leave by failing to contribute to the songwriting process or drive the creation of new albums. Gilmour flatly rejected this premise, retorting publicly that Pink Floyd would continue as an active, recording entity without him. The ensuing legal battle consumed the band from 1986 to 1987. During this period, Waters mounted his own solo tours, occasionally playing in cities near where Gilmour and Mason were attempting to re-establish the Pink Floyd brand. The public dispute grew increasingly bitter. At one point, Waters threatened further legal action demanding payment for the band's continued use of the iconic flying pig stage prop. In response, Pink Floyd deliberately modified the physical design of their touring pig, specifically to circumvent Waters' copyright claims and spite his legal threats. Ultimately, Waters' attempt to dissolve the band through the courts failed. On December 23, 1987, a formal legal settlement was reached. The agreement granted David Gilmour and Nick Mason the exclusive, perpetual right to continue recording and touring under the name Pink Floyd. In exchange, Roger Waters received sole ownership and performance rights over the entirety of the Wall concept and its associated material. With the legal rights secured, Gilmour assumed full leadership of Pink Floyd. His first major decision was to invite Richard Wright back into the organization. Given the lingering legal complexities of Wright's 1979 termination, he was initially rehired only as a salaried session and touring musician, though he would eventually be reinstated as a full partner in the years that followed.
There's an awful lot of absence, an awful lot of people not really quite being there in this post-Dark Side of the Moon period.
In the autumn of 1987, the newly reformed group released A Momentary Lapse of Reason. It was the first Pink Floyd album created without Waters' involvement. The record was a commercial success, reaching number 3 on both the US and UK charts, and achieving a 4x platinum certification in the United States. Waters responded to the release with intense public hostility. He utilized the music press to lambast the reunion, explicitly referring to the new album as a clever forgery. He categorized the musical compositions as poor in general, and publicly dismissed Gilmour's lyrical efforts as third-rate. Behind the scenes, the remaining members acknowledged the profound difficulty of operating without their former primary songwriter. Richard Wright candidly agreed with some of the structural criticisms, admitting to the press that A Momentary Lapse of Reason was not truly a band album at all, but rather a Gilmour-driven project. Gilmour himself later admitted that the band struggled heavily to find a cohesive creative direction without Waters' strict narrative guidance. Nick Mason offered the bleakest assessment of their psychological state, stating that both he and Wright had been completely destroyed by Waters' long-term behavior, leaving them with so little confidence that they contributed very little to the actual recording of the comeback album. Decades after the settlement, the animosity generated by the creation of The Wall continued to define the legacy of the musicians. Gilmour would later observe that Waters had fundamentally lost sight of the fact that Pink Floyd possessed an inherent cultural value that extended far beyond his individual involvement. Waters, in turn, maintained for years that his former colleagues had merely followed the letter of the law regarding the band's name, while he alone had followed the creative spirit of the group. It was not until 2013 that Waters publicly admitted he regretted initiating the lawsuit, acknowledging that he had underestimated the enduring power of the band's legacy. The commercial footprint of The Wall remains monumental. Double counted for its 2-disc format, the album achieved a staggering 23 times platinum certification from the RIAA, with worldwide sales exceeding 30 million copies. It stands as one of the best-selling concept albums in the history of recorded music. Yet, the album's massive success is permanently intertwined with its destructive internal cost. The rigid perfectionism and absolute control required to execute a project of such scale succeeded in producing a cultural landmark, but it systematically dismantled the human foundation of the band that created it. The physical wall constructed on stage each night served as a perfect, unintended metaphor for the reality occurring behind it, a barrier that secured their legacy while permanently ending their collaboration.